Hello, and welcome to the second video from the Florence Nightingale Mentoring Programme at King's. It's designed to connect students and recent graduates to King's professional alumni so that they can tap into their wealth of experience and expertise. If you'd like to join the mentoring programme, simply register using the link in the video description. Now, for this video, we're very excited to be introducing one of King's most prominent and experienced thought leaders in healthcare, Professor Marie Rafferty. Marie Rafferty is Professor of Nursing Policy, former Dean of the Florence Nightingale Faculty of Nursing, Midwifery and Palliative Care, King's College London. She is a historian, health workforce expert and policy researcher. First nurse to gain a doctorate from Oxford University, she was seconded to the Department of Health to work with Lord Aradazi on the review of the NHS and awarded a CBE for services to healthcare in 2008. She served on the Prime Minister's Commission on the Future of Nursing and Midwifery 2009-10 and has been a recipient of various awards. The list goes on, but let's hear from Professor Marie herself. Over to you, Marie.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Sophie, for those very generous words of introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and talking to you all today. So mentoring and role modelling are two very important features that have shaped my career. So I just want to spend the next 20, possibly 30 minutes talking to you about who my key mentors were and the contribution that they made to shaping my career. And when I thought back on who these key mentors actually were, I found myself asking a question about, well, how do we define mentoring and who exactly might these people be? So I took mentoring to mean something of a sustained contact over time. It wasn't something that was very fleeting or episodic. So I'm defining mentorship and therefore its influence as something which has actually stayed with me over a reasonably protracted period of time. And secondly, it's been people who have inspired me to even greater things, often things that I could never even have dreamt of. So mentors are also people who help you to raise your aspirations, see a whole set of possibilities that might not otherwise be obvious to you, and sometimes take your career off, or your life as well, off in unexpected directions. And for me, that's also been characterized by my mentors being really coming from different disciplines. Many of them have been nurses, both academics and clinicians, but not exclusively. I've also had the enormous benefit of working with some leading minds, not just from healthcare, but also historians and indeed doctors, as well as other healthcare practitioners. So I owe a great debt of gratitude to my mentors, and in some ways this is a way of saying thank you to them. This little roll call is by no means exhaustive, but I've just selected out a few from different stages of my career because I was a student over quite a long period of time, and I've been a student of different things. So I just want to give you a bit of an overview and insight into who some of these special people have been in my life. And I want to start off by making the point that actually, for me, having a career in nursing was never a foregone conclusion, actually, because I got off to quite a sticky start. But it was someone who became a mentor to me, who actually helped me stay the course. Because although I did an undergraduate degree in nursing studies at the University of Edinburgh was in fact the first university in Europe to offer a degree in nursing. So it was something of a pioneer in the field. And degree nurses at that time, and we're talking about a long time ago, the 1970s, were only a tiny minority of the profession. So regarded perhaps in some quarters with some degree of skepticism. And it was very much the case that in some areas, this skepticism was something that had to be really combated with some vigour and robustness. And my first ward placement, having done a year of academic work with some clinical experience and skills development, was quite a challenging placement for me. It was a long-term care of the elderly ward. Patients had a variety of neurological deficits, some with severe dementia. And it was probably what was known as a very heavy ward. The demands workload-wise were quite extreme. And I found myself as a student, as the only student on that ward in this long-term care facility. And it took me quite a while to adapt to this different type environment. But thanks to a wonderful tutor called Leslie Hardy, who was a Canadian nurse doing her MSc at the University of Edinburgh. And these students who were doing their MScs, they gained their clinical experience by actually being our clinical supervisors and tutors during this placement experience. So we were extremely fortunate to have that support in practice. But nevertheless, having that support in practice, and Leslie, and indeed one of her colleagues, Leslie Page, who eventually turned out to rise to the dizzying heights of being the president of the Royal College of Midwives in this country. Leslie Hardy was a very creative teacher and highly supportive and innovative in the methods that she shared with us. So we were not only checking ourselves up to be strong clinicians, but she also invited us to keep a log of our experience, a diary, to reflect upon what was going on in clinical practice. We also had assignments, care plans to complete. But it was this log that was actually quite interesting and important for me, because in the process of recording my response to practice, I noticed that I was becoming quite anxious and indeed agitated at times, and actually quite unhappy. And it took a while for it to dawn on me that the reason that was happening was because actually I was being bullied. So this was the first time that I was bullied in nursing. It wasn't the last time, actually. And really, once I realised that, partly in discussion with Leslie, we set about trying to tackle it and confront the people and the practices. So that is something that I was able to do with Leslie's support. I'm not sure whether I ever would have been able to do it without her support. And it was very interesting because having done that, the sense of isolation and the sense of being very anxious about practice started to fall away. So Leslie was important not just as someone who was helping me to gain skills and understand what was a healthcare of the elderly placement and some of the challenges, behavioural and emotional challenges of some of these patients and their families. But she also helped me confront, really a major cultural feature of healthcare in the NHS, which, as our staff surveys unfortunately demonstrate, bullying is a practice which is still somewhat endemic within the National Health Service. So standing up to that type of behaviour was very important, because quite frankly, I really don't think I'd be sitting here talking to you today had it not been for Leslie's intervention and support, because I was really set to say, well, if this is what nursing's about, you can just beam me up, Scotty. I am out of here. I don't want to be part of this. So really thanks to Leslie, and of course peer support from some of my fellow classmates, I did decide to carry on. And thankfully, my next placement was a much more positive one. And in fact, it was the complete contrast of the previous one, because I ended up in a ward which was excellent in every regard. Why? Because where the leadership deficits were absent in the previous ward, and it shows you just, you know, the huge variation in clinical experience that we can all be exposed to. The importance of clinical leadership cannot be underestimated. In fact, it is still, you know, the single most important aspect of quality of student experience and patient experience as well, the way in which a ward is actually led. And this was a fantastic ward sister called Elise Nielsen, who was an expert in surgery, vascular surgeries that happened, and she was an outstanding individual. And it's not irrelevant that she was actually herself a graduate, and in fact she was a graduate of the Nightingale School. So she had moved from St Thomas's up to Edinburgh to become one of its leading clinical sisters. And she was not just an outstanding teacher, she was a natural teacher, Elise, and very keen on supporting us in practice, constantly asking us questions and really firing our, what I call our clinical imaginations. Well, you also had to know your kit, so you were making sure you were learning in anticipation of being asked questions by Elise, and of course her staff. This was socialised into the practice of all the staff nurses, and it's very interesting that this ward was staffed exclusively by graduate nurses. So here was a little oasis of graduate nurses in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, which is where I was placed. And the other remarkable feature, notwithstanding the fact that she was just a brilliant teacher and a brilliant clinician, was that she was also very cultured. She enjoyed a very lively social life, but she was out at the theatre reading, very interested in music, ballet, etc., what was going on in the world. And she had excellent relationship with the medical staff. So everyone worked as a team, and you really felt that sense of cohesion. And it went not just across the qualified staff, but the healthcare assistive personnel. They were very important, and I have very fond memories of those members of staff as well, and the way in which their skills were highly valued. Elise used praise a lot and positive feedback to help gee up your motivation. And I think, you know, psychologically, she was a very emotionally intelligent leader. She was also an innovator. She introduced patient allocation as a system of care into the Royal Infirmary. And that became something which was quite vanguardist at the time, and a number of different leaders came to visit to see how we'd organised our care and our assessment methods. So it was like a natural laboratory for learning, and we loved it. And subsequently, it made such an impression on me that that's where I went to be a staff nurse after I qualified, and where I was promoted to deputy sister to support Elise. So that had a longer kind of legacy, that placement, insofar as it saw me through into the transition into becoming a fully qualified staff nurse and ultimately a deputy sister. But it wasn't just clinical role models who influenced me. Of course, there were academic nurses who were very important in my portfolio. Three stand out as being important from the university side. Alison Tierney, some of you may have heard of the Tierney, Roper and Logan fame, produced a stellar and blockbuster of a textbook which has really influenced the way we think about organising care and nursing practice. So Alison was my tutor, and again, like Elise and like Leslie, these were people who also became good friends as I matured in my career, that I use, you know, the relationship with whom has had continuity over many years, and we've kept in touch and have been very important at critical junctures when I've needed to ring them up or talk to them over coffee, or perhaps even something slightly stronger than coffee, and get some advice. So Alison made a profound impression on me as well, because at the time when I was an undergraduate, she had fairly recently finished her PhD. She was also starting a family, and she seemed very young to me to, you know, have a doctorate. And I think seeing these brilliant nurses who were intellectually top drawer really, really inspired me. It was another world where nurses could be working with the brightest and the best. So that was a feature which I think was very important in kind of engineering itself into what I thought the future for nursing, and perhaps my own future might be as well. So Alison was very influential, and she invited me to several seminars and the Edinburgh Medical Group, which was an ethics discussion group, and I became a kind of student follower and a student member, a little groupie, and in fact organised some student seminars from that group. So that was a wonderful thing to be part of. So it's that generosity of spirit, I think, people looking out for you and opening doors and offering opportunities, that became really important. The other person was Elizabeth Hockey, who was Alison's predecessor, because Alison became a professor in the Department of Nursing Studies, but she also became a director of the Nursing Research Unit in Edinburgh, which was only one of two in the country, national research units, where there was a critical mass of nurses applying their intellects and problem-solving skills to some of the great care questions of the day. And Elizabeth Hockey, Dr. Elizabeth Hockey, was a very interesting woman. She was the first director of that unit. And I encountered Elizabeth because some of the research staff came to teach us as undergraduates. We undertook research assignments. So I think we were being somehow injected with research mindedness and an approach to generating evidence and questioning care. Our course was really about developing a critique and a critical inquiry in relation to care. And Lisbeth was really at the forefront of that movement. And she and Annie Altschul, someone else I'd like to mention, were very influential in the field of nursing and building up the academic and research base. But their journeys into Edinburgh were extremely challenging, because they both came from Austria and had escaped from the German invasion of Austria in the late 1930s. So their careers in nursing as well were never a foregone conclusion. I mean, in the case of Annie, she had been studying mathematics at the University of Vienna. In the case of Lisbeth, she'd been studying medicine at the University of Graz. And here they were, essentially found themselves both working in very humble roles as domestic servants in the Second World War, which was one of the few options that were actually open to refugees at the time in Britain. domestic service or nursing. So both Annie and Lisbeth ended up in nursing eventually, not automatically, and made their careers in the university sector. It's very interesting. You can argue that had it not been for Hitler, then there may never have been development of an undergraduate prospectus in nursing in Europe itself. So there's a very interesting story to be told, which has been told in a number of historical analyses by Rosemary Weir from Edinburgh, and I've written about this topic myself. So Lisbeth was very influential as well, and these seminars that were held at the research unit were something that I felt drawn to and attended, and I suppose what I was particularly attracted to was that there was a critical mass of very engaged, intellectually engaged nurses asking questions and actually doing research into solving these practice puzzles. And I thought, gosh, I mean, I was actually a bit of a loner in the sense that I was the only undergraduate who seemed to go to these seminars. Maybe that was a sad reflection on me at the time, but I found them fascinating and a source of inspiration. And I was welcomed in. I mean, it was a very, it was a very warm reception that I had. So that's another kind of signal of the culture of generosity in which these seminars operated. There were postgraduates, there were the full-time research staff at the centre. But in 1979, the first summer school was being held, which was bringing research nurses from across Europe to actually congregate in Edinburgh for a few weeks in order to learn, I think it was 2 weeks actually, research methods and join forces and develop something of a network, because there were other little pockets of activity in other European centres beginning to spring up at that time. And there was an advertisement for it. And so I went to see Lisbeth and said, oh, Lisbeth, do you think I could, I don't think I called her Lisbeth, it's probably Dr. Hockey. Do you think there's any chance at all that I could come along to the summer school? And she sort of looked at me askance and said, you realise you have to pay? And I said, oh, golly, that's going to be quite difficult. And she said, well, hang on a wee minute. Perhaps if you're prepared to do the catering for the summer school and odd jobs around the place, then maybe you could attend for free. So in exchange for doing the catering and being a kind of Girl Friday to the summer school, I got to attend all the classes and hang out with these budding nurse researchers. And I had something about it that was like being in a kind of mini salon for nursing research. And I just thought this was fabulous. And, this is the world I want to be part of in the future. But thanks to Lisbeth for enabling me to be there. So both clinical and academic nurses were very important to me in my undergraduate career. But there were also others, who were important in sparking my interest in history, because Edinburgh was unusual that it had an academic offer in history of medicine and history of science. And I was transfixed by both these subjects. So there were two other people I'd like to mention who helped to fuel my interest in these topics. So the first was Marie Burrell, who came from California, and she was a lecturer in the history of medicine at Edinburgh. And this was very much an experimental course. It was really geared for medics. So again, gosh, I don't know where I got my courage from. I just went and knocked on her door and I said, I know this is really geared for first-year medics, but can I come along too? And the courses were designed in such a way at Edinburgh that there was quite a lot of scope for flexibility. So I was able to take a course in the history of medicine and in the history of science. And I loved the history of medicine. It was so fascinating. And I found myself, as an undergraduate nurse, spending quite a lot of time hanging out at the Royal Scottish Museum in a 250th anniversary exhibition of the history of the Edinburgh Medical School. So I learned a lot about that. But the history of science course was also very interesting. And it turned out that that had a little quirk of fate and story attached to it, because again, a very generous professor, Eric Forbes, allowed me to attend the History of Science course. But as it turned out, I did that in the first year, and the second year, he was the main tutor. It turned out that actually I was the only person in the class. I mean, it would never happen these days. And normally, of course, no one would run a course like that. And he said, well, why don't you just come along? And basically, I mean, I became his research assistant. He had me going into archives. I went to the British Library. I went to the National Library of Scotland. I did the third year history honours option in Renaissance and medieval scientific thought, and was taught one-to-one by Eric. I had keys to his office. We had great chats. I mean, he was an amazingly generous mentor. And, you know, that was a deal. He got the coffee, I got the biscuits, and, you know, he gave me full access to his office. It was absolutely awesome. So Eric was another key supporter, and I think that's also what helped to cement my interest in studying history of medicine and history of nursing later on in life. So that was really my undergraduate career at Edinburgh, but it wouldn't be complete without mentioning Annie Altschul as well. I think she was one of our tutors, and indeed had an incredible intellect and pioneer of mental health, nursing and research, and she was my mentor for mental health nursing placement. And she had this incredibly scary Socratic mode of teaching where she just sort of asked you these rhetorical questions and we all sat there like leaden lumps in tutorials, terrified to respond to her. But actually it forced us to actually become articulate and speak our minds in class, which I think is something that all of us benefited from later on in our own clinical careers. And Annie was very interested and did some pioneering work in the therapeutic interaction between mental health nurses and patients. What was it about that behaviour and interaction that made it beneficial and therapeutic for patients? And she wrote about this in her thesis and one of the Churchill Livingston nursing aid series of the time. But I'll never forget her lecture series when, as a first year, she just came in the room, spoke without notes for 15 minutes. Our first lecture on Erik Erikson's 7 Ages of Man, from top to bottom. And it was like a beautifully, aesthetically rounded argument that she presented, a thesis, and that she set up, then she refuted, and then she had a kind of synthesis and conclusion at the end. It was just an amazingly well-crafted argument using a very, very interesting kind of method that was very idiosyncratic and, you know, intellectually fueled and very much her own style. So being exposed to some of the best minds, academic minds in the university, as well as in nursing, and some of the best clinicians were some of the things that I took away from my undergraduate career at Edinburgh, which set me on a very, I think, strong footing to then go into staffing with Elise and her team at the Royal Infirmary. And but then never quite losing the research itch. And Leslie, whom I mentioned earlier on, after she'd done her MSc, actually came back to Edinburgh to pursue her PhD, and we were reunited. Actually, I bumped into her in the university cafe, which I spent more time in the university cafe than I probably should have. But that again was a friendship that was very important to me. And another colleague of hers who was also doing her PhD, Marie Rafferty, who now is actually leading the standards development for the NMC, Nursing Midwifery Council, became another great friend. And I invited one of my nursing buddies from my class, Isabel Freenan, as a little quartet. We had this little discussion group, and that was again another source of support and kind of co-mentorship and coaching to keep each of us going. I ended up writing some articles with Leslie So I published with her while I was still a student, and that carried me in good stead into my nursing career. And then the next step was really as going into clinical research, because I didn't really want to lose my clinical contact at all, and wanted to pursue both research and clinical expertise at the same time. So the posts were advertised in a university in Nottingham and the Queen's Medical Centre. So I set forth and left Edinburgh and moved to Nottingham. And there I was lucky enough to be the recipient of a scholarship award. I did an MPhil by thesis, was supervised by Jack Hardcastle, Professor of Surgery, and Dr. Pamela Hawthorne, who sadly is no longer with us. And with my colleague Josie Kloss, who is a professor at Leeds, and others, we did some, I think, groundbreaking clinical work, at the time clinical intervention work, very much in the quantitative mode. And in fact, that work won 3M Nursing Times Award for research. So that wasn't always easy to combine clinical work and research, but I was again very fortunate to be supported by two outstanding academics, and Jack Hardcastle was especially supportive as my first supervisor. But I then took a different kind of track, and again it was one of these forks in the road. After I'd finished in Nottingham, I thought, well, what am I going to do next? And this kind of itch and you know, this motivation to revisit history was still very much with me. And so I had some friends in Oxford, and again, I don't know where this courage came from, or perhaps brazenness came from, but I found myself knocking on the door of the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine in Oxford, because I knew there was because I had an association with the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine in Edinburgh with Merrily Burrell, again, who was a fantastic supporter. And Merrily very kindly wrote me a reference, as did Eric Forbes, for the Wellcome Unit. And I was lucky enough to be able to apply for a scholarship to study at Oxford without having a full history degree, but through the generosity of my supervisor and mentor, Charles Webster, was able to complete a doctorate there in the history of medicine and history of nursing. And that was published as a thesis. So I did take a kind of, you know, slightly diverted route from nursing, although it was still studying nursing, and then move into, from that into academic lecturing as well. But I had also simultaneously applied to the Marsden, Royal Marsden. I'd also enjoyed oncology as one of my placements. And so I'd been accepted on the Royal Marsden course, which, you know, again had to make the choice. Do I go to Oxford or do I go to the Royal Marsden? And I thought, well, the Royal Marsden were willing to keep my place. And I didn't think I was going to get the opportunity to study in Oxford again. So I could never have dreamt of going to Oxford. But again, it was really the openness of Charles Webster as a historian, the official historian of the National Health Service, and his desire to basically take a risk with someone like me, nurse who'd never actually done this type of work before, which made it all possible. And I joined a model community of scholars at the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine and Green College, now Green Templeton College, to actually complete my doctorate there. But I'd like to say, you know, several other mentors have been important to me. Jane Robinson, a role model and exemplar in nursing policy. There was a lot of very exciting work being published by Jane Phil Strong and her team of people. She was then building a department. The little unit I was part of in Nottingham became a fully fledged school, and she recruited me back to Nottingham. And then a few years later, I was lucky enough to win a Harkness Fellowship and go to the States and study with Linda Aiken as my mentor. looking at the lobbying tactics and how nursing had managed to influence the Clinton health reform effort in the United States. So Linda Aiken was a beacon of expertise and an exemplary role model and leader in the field. And I learned a huge amount at that point. Little did I know in the mid-1990s that fellowship would be the springboard to collaborating with Linda for almost 15 years in research, some research that we've undertaken into nurse staffing patient outcomes, which has subsequently become very influential. And Linda learned so much from her and her generosity over the years. There's no one knows how to speak to policymakers, is more articulate in formulating those key policy messages from nursing to policy audience as Linda Aiken. And I feel so privileged to have had her as someone who has been the mainstay of my mentorship in the latter part of my career. There are many other people that I could mention, but I think perhaps I'll stop there and invite some questions.
Thank you for sharing your experience with us, Anne-Marie. I've just got a few questions for you. The first one is, why did you decide to move from nursing to becoming an academic?
Well, I think as you probably heard from what I've said, I think I always saw these as twin tracks. I didn't see it as an either or, but actually early on in my career, my ambition was very much to be a first-class clinician, and I think that's why I made a beeline for Elisa's ward, because I could see that she had very high standards and she held us to those standards, and that was something which all of us valued. And it was underpinned as well by a group of people, a community, if you like, who were high performers themselves and always intellectually very curious. And in fact, it was really Elise who got me started on the research track, because she was dishing out essays and assignments to the students. And I said, oh, I'd like one of those. Can I do it? And so that was really the beginning of my research proposal that eventually ended up taking me to Nottingham. So I think we need to think about these things as running in parallel and build clinical academic careers for nurses and midwives into the future and make that an easy option, not something that is quite difficult to craft at the moment.
And our next question is, what is your view on having a successful career in healthcare, given the state of the NHS?
Well, I think there, of course, as we know from vacancy rates, there is going to be an increasing demand for high caliber clinicians within the National Health Service. And I think opportunities now pre-doctorally, there's a new scheme to help nurses and midwives and allied health professionals to actually combine research with clinical practice and get on that research track. So, and then when we look to the future, care is one of the big growth areas in employment. So there's going to be an increasing demand for clinicians who can work with complexity, clinicians who are sophisticated in their repertoire of skills and capabilities. And that means being underpinned by strong academic and evidence-based practice.
And then what would you say were your biggest career challenges and opportunities?
Well, I think challenges is sticking with it when the going gets tough, and I think that's a generic kind of thing. But seeking out support, surrounding yourself by people who you can learn from and who engage you in that learning, and who are very, very good at what they do. I mean, seeking out people who are the best in class, and I think I've always been drawn to people who are leaders in their field. And I think we need to do more of that in a strategic way. Single out the best and go and ask them, can I come and work with you? And it's, people more often say yes than no. It's surprising, actually, if you go and ask someone, if you can, like me knocking on Elizabeth Hockey's door and the door of the welcome unit. I mean, that took quite a lot of guts and courage. And you know, you might argue, gall at one level. And but you know, I was very keen to do it, and so I did it, and it worked. Go for it is my advice.
And then lastly, how do you think the healthcare field will progress in the future? What does it look like to you?
Well, I think, you know, healthcare is going to grow in terms of the demographics, as we know, and the kind of disease profiles. But I think what we're going to need are people who can deal with complexity and can parallel process in their problem-solving capabilities, and who are really on top of the frontier knowledge that we need in order to make breakthroughs and innovate in practice. Because those are the skills of dealing with complexity organizationally, intellectually, and emotionally that are going to be in high demand, not just in healthcare, but across all of the growth industries. And I think we need to be building those relationships at university and working with across disciplines. That's the only way that we are actually going to be able to solve the complex, knotty, and enduring challenges that confront healthcare now and into the future.
Well, that was our final question, Professor Rafferty. I'd like to thank you all for joining this video. If you're looking for a mentor, you can always sign up to King's Connect mentoring program. The link is in the description below. Thank you for your time, and please I'd like to thank Marie Rafferty again for sharing her experience with us. And this video is brought to you by the Florence Nightingale mentoring program. Until next time, bye then.
Thank you, bye.